Hello and welcome to the Neurologic podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we will be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is Neurologic. Hello and welcome back. Today we're doing something a little different. Our guest is Dr. Michael Rugg, the director of the Center for Vital Longevity and a pioneer in memory research.
But our conversation today is actually going to be about the work of Dr. Eleanor Maguire, a visionary cognitive neuroscientist at the University College London, and whose research transformed how we think about memory and the brain.
Sadly, Dr. Maguire passed away at the beginning of this year, so we wanted to dedicate this episode to her and to her groundbreaking research in the world of memory, navigation, and imagination.
Dr. Rugg joins us today not only as her scientific peer and collaborator, but also as a friend, and he's here to reflect on her impactful work and share some glimpses into who she was as a person.
You might know her from the now famous London taxi driver study, or from her work showing that memory isn't just about recalling the past, it's also a tool for imagining the future, building identity, and navigating the world.
So join us as we celebrate one of neuroscience's most influential thinkers and reflect on the lasting impact of her work on how we understand memory today. Dr. Rugg, thank you so much for being here. So for our listeners, Amber and I are actually in Dr. Rugg's lab here at CVL. So Mick, how did you first meet Dr. Eleanor Maguire, and what was your first impression of her?
So I met her because she was a postdoctoral fellow working with Dr. Chris Frith at the Functional Imaging Laboratory, Wellcome Functional Imaging Laboratory in London, in Queen Square, which I moved to in 1998. And I met her in the context of discussions about research at various kinds of lab meetings and the like. She was interested at that time, or by that time, in spatial navigation and spatial memory. My first impression was a very motivated, very committed person to research, but also a very warm and pleasant person to hang out with.
She once described herself as a comedy lover, a long-suffering supporter of Crystal Palace Football Club, and prone to getting lost, actually, which is funny because she studied spatial navigation and memory. So how would you describe her, both as a person and a colleague?
As I said, very warm, but also very focused and interested in her research, very articulate and very clear about her own views and where she wanted to take them and how she wanted to take those with research. She's just a great colleague.
So Eleanor was a pioneer in memory research. So how did your connection to her work in memory begin?
From the get-go, she was interested in what, from my point of view, was a very unconventional approach. I came and still do memory research from a relatively traditional approach. Mm-hmm. And Eleanor, from the get-go, wanted to study memory in the wild, so to speak. So what she was interested in is how does memory work in as near to real-life situations as you can get them in the laboratory, and also in the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, which is a real challenge. Mm-hmm. So her approach was, you could call it ecological, rather than lab-based. And so very different sort of tradition of memory research. So it was fascinating to discuss the relative merits of the two approaches with her.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So she's very well known for her work on the hippocampus and memory. And the hippocampus is a small seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain. So what do you think initially drew her to that line of research, as far as you know?
So as far as I know, it was because she was interested in navigation and how people get around the world, maybe because she wasn't so good at it herself. And also in not just memory, but as I said, real-time navigation as well. And the hippocampus has long been associated with space and getting around in space. Mm-hmm. And she was working and collaborating not only with Chris Frith, but with John O'Keefe and Neil Burgess. Many people will have heard of John O'Keefe as one of the discoverers of place cells in the hippocampus. He won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for his contribution to the understanding of hippocampus. And I think that's what drew her in to an interest in the hippocampus particularly. Yeah. It's worth emphasizing, though, that she was not hippocampocentric in the sense that that was the be-all and end-all. Yeah. And she made major contributions to our understanding of brain networks involved in navigation and memory, as well as the hippocampus.
Yeah, so one thing that seems to be coming up again and again as we're talking about Eleanor is just how creative and forward-thinking her methods were. Yeah. So what made her research methods stand out so much during that time?
So I think she, along with Neil Burgess, was one of the earliest cognitive neuroscientists to adopt virtual reality technology and to use it in the context of brain imaging. So the idea being that you could use virtual reality to get people, when they're lying in a scanner, to essentially simulate what it would be like to navigate, let's say, around an unfamiliar town. And I think that was incredibly innovative and gave us some real insights into what happens in real time as people are using their hippocampi or hippocampuses to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, this was back in the mid-90s, right?
That's right.
So this was such a new technology that was coming out.
That's right. So the original study, the very first study using virtual reality in an imaging context was actually using an imaging method called positron emission tomography, which we don't use very much now in healthy participants. But at the time that this work was being developed, what's so-called PET scanning was the only option if you wanted to track what was going on in the brain as people were carrying out different kinds of tasks.
Mm-hmm. Now we typically use fMRI,
that's right,
functional magnetic resonance imaging for these scans.
Yeah.
So our listeners may know Eleanor from one of her most famous studies, which is the London taxi driver study. Mm-hmm. For those people who haven't heard about that, could you walk us through the study and tell us what made it such a turning point in memory research?
Yeah. So for those who are unaware, London taxi drivers undergo a very intense period of training. They literally have to memorize the map of Greater London, meaning that if you get into a London taxi, all you have to do is give the driver the address of anywhere in Greater London, and they'll take you there. They don't use GPS. They don't look anything up, and also they know all the different ways of getting from A to B, so they can make diversions if there's a traffic jam or whatever. So these people have incredibly well-developed spatial memories, and also they spend their lives engaged in spatial navigation. Mm-hmm. That's what they do for a living. Mm-hmm. So Eleanor had the thought, well, maybe there's something special about these people's brains as a result of this very intensive training and the way that they use this training in their everyday lives. So she decided to look at the structure of the hippocampus of, I think it was originally 16 London taxi drivers, I think it was 16, along with a group of carefully matched non-driver controls. Mm-hmm. And what they found was not that the hippocampus was bigger in the taxi drivers. Sometimes that's how the results are described. What happened was they had a relatively smaller front of the hippocampus, but a relatively larger back of the hippocampus. Mm-hmm. In other words, there was a kind of different distribution of volume along the axis of the hippocampus in the taxi drivers compared to the control participants. And also the degree of this change in volume correlated with how long the taxi drivers had been doing the job.
So just to clarify, basically when you're talking about that ratio, it's their posterior hippocampus,
That's right.
The back part that was larger in relation to the
and the
front.
Anterior hippocampus was actually smaller. So the posterior or rear end of the hippocampus was larger, but the very front end was actually smaller. So there was no change in the overall size, no difference in the overall size. That's a very well-known study. What's less known, I think, is the follow-up study. So in that original study, the people who were the comparison participants were just everyday people. And you could argue that the differences between the taxi drivers and the control participants may not have anything to do with driving so much as something like movement related or manual effort or whatever. So in a follow-up study, the control participants became bus drivers. So London bus drivers drive fixed routes around London, but they have to, in all sorts of other ways, they're very comparable to the taxi drivers, except they don't have to memorize and use spatial information. They're driving a fixed route. And the results were essentially identical, with the bus drivers as the comparison participants. That is the more elegant of the two studies.
So meaning that what they originally found, where this posterior back area of the hippocampus is larger, they still found that compared to these bus drivers.
They did, yes.
Wow. So the bus drivers didn't show that change, even though they're driving around the same streets, but they didn't do that test.
And they're exposed to the same pollutants.
So really
the same stress.
Really the difference there is just how the London taxi drivers have so much more variance in these landmarks and streets that they have to memorize, whereas the bus drivers just have a fixed route.
Right.
Okay.
That's the idea. They also did one other study where they followed people from when they began to learn the layout of London until they took the test to decide whether they qualified as taxi drivers. And those drivers who passed the test had the same differences compared to those that didn't pass the test as had been found for bus drivers and the like. So it's a very interesting story.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, so basically it was one of the first studies showing that the adult brain can change and adapt, right? And reorganize its pathways and form new connections through experience, which we kind of refer to more as neuroplasticity.
That's right.
So that's
it's one of
it's
incredibly important study to show that in adults you could get changes in brain structure that seem to correlate with ability.
Yeah, and I read that she received the 2003 Ig Nobel Prize for medicine for that.
She was very touched to receive that.
For those who don't know, the Ig Nobel Prize is a parody of the Nobel Prize, but it's given to work that's very kind of unexpected or unusual and creative and kind of inspires a different type of research, which I think that would definitely qualify as that.
So one of the frustrations for Eleanor was, it's a bit like, as she put it, it's like a rock guitarist who had a famous hit early on in their careers. All anyone ever wants to hear about is that, and pay no attention to anything else that they've done subsequently. She found that quite frustrating.
Really? Yeah. It was very groundbreaking, and it's very interesting as well.
Yeah, for that, especially for the time then. Kind of going back to, we kind of touched a little bit on neuroplasticity, but I kind of want to focus more on what that is and why it's so, this study really like pioneered that. This is shown in also adults, because we thought this was just happening in younger adults. Like kids, younger adults. Yeah. So can you kind of break down a little bit more what neuroplasticity is? What are we talking about when we're saying that?
So when we're looking in human brains with magnetic resonance imaging, all we can see is relatively coarse-grained structure. So we don't directly know, for example, what it is that's changing in the hippocampus when you see these structural changes, for example, in taxi drivers compared to other people. The term neuroplasticity, strictly speaking, should be applied when we know that what is happening is that we're getting changes in nerve connections, in synapses that are connecting different neurons together. So strictly speaking, neural plasticity would have to be investigated at the kind of microscopic or the neurophysiological level, and that requires studies in non-human animals. You can't really study plasticity at that level in humans. So when we look at things like structural changes in the hippocampus, we're making an inference that what's underlying this is plasticity, but we don't know that for sure because we can't directly measure it.
So from your perspective, how has her work changed the way we think about memory and spatial navigations? So prior to like this London taxi driver research that she did, how did researchers think about memory, spatial navigation, how the hippocampus played a role in that? And now we come with Eleanor's study. How did that shift this perspective?
Right. So I think what it did was bring into human cognitive neuroscience a perspective that already existed within a particular tradition of studying navigation and spatial memory in non-human animals, particularly in rats. So John O'Keefe, along with some of his collaborators, such as Lynn Nadell, had long argued that it is an artificial distinction to distinguish, at least when it comes to the hippocampus, between real-time navigation, moving around the world, and remembering features of the world. And the hippocampus seems to be important both for spatial memory, this is in rodents, spatial memory and spatial navigation. And for John O'Keefe and his colleagues, there is an intimate relationship between these two. And from their perspective, the more general memory functions that the hippocampus has, for example, in humans, they stem from the original function of the hippocampus earlier in evolution, which was to subserve space and navigation. So what Eleanor's work did was to bring that tradition fully into the human cognitive neuroscience world, the human memory world, with these very elegant experiments, particularly the virtual reality experiments that she performed.
Yeah. Because, I mean, before her work, we knew about, like you mentioned at the beginning, these place cells in the hippocampus of rats.
Yeah.
So we kind of had an idea of how the hippocampus is related to the spatial navigation.
Yeah.
But like you said, I think her research really brought it to the human area as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're kind of thinking of time as being that kind of space that you're maneuvering in versus...
Absolutely.
Space, yeah.
So this is not work that I think Eleanor directly was conducting, or another tradition of research that came out of this particular perspective was the idea that within the hippocampus you would find cells that not only tracked where you were, but also tracked time. These have been discovered. These are called time cells. And they appear to have a similar role with respect to time that place cells have with respect to place.
So I'm curious, what was Eleanor's reaction to how widely her research resonated beyond academic circles?
Well, as I said, I think she got frustrated by the fact that what everyone focused on was the taxi driver study, to the cost of her many other major contributions. So as I said, she felt like an aging rock star.
So she also did work on imagining future events
Absolutely.
and memory construction, and she helped to show that memory isn't just about the past, but also she made the connection between remembering the past and imagining the future.
Yeah.
So what do you think made that overlap between memory and imagination so compelling to her?
So I think she was looking at the hippocampus from the get-go, and particularly with respect to what you've just been talking about, as doing more than memory. So for her, the hippocampus plays a crucial role in what's called construction, scene construction. So the idea is you need your hippocampus if you're going to either generate an image of the past, or you're going to try to generate an image of what could happen in the future. So one of her very influential studies in the mid-2000s was demonstrating that people with severe memory impairments, because of hippocampal damage, had as much difficulty envisaging the future as they did in remembering the past. So these people, if you ask them, for example, imagine that you are taking a vacation next year on a tropical island, describe what it's like, have very impoverished descriptions, very generic descriptions, compared to what a healthy participant would come up with. So I think that was a starting point for the notion of the hippocampus playing a role more generally in scene construction.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, if I was asked to imagine being on a beach next week, I'd be basing that on my experiences on beaches or pictures of beaches that I've seen. And
I was literally about to bring that up. Yeah. I don't know why we're both thinking about beaches. And I was about to ask, like, if I picture myself in a beach, am I basically constructing that kind of?
That would be my explanation.
Yeah.
That was not Eleanor's explanation.
Oh, really? What was hers?
So Eleanor's view was the hippocampus was not simply there to retrieve information from the past. It was there to actually construct a new representation that was based on that past information. So the idea is that you're actually constructing on the fly a representation. And it's not simply a matter of dredging your memory. You're actually taking information and then richly constructing a rich new representation of a possible world. And she saw the hippocampus as being crucial for that construction process, not just assembling the bits of information that you're going to use.
Okay, so it's not like it's just taking the information of what I know of beaches and helping me imagine. It's actively stitching together.
That's right.
I guess, information about...
Yeah. So she has an entire theory about hippocampal function, which is what she describes as the scene construction hypothesis or theory. And that is predicated on the idea that the hippocampus is crucial for anything that's associated with space. And much of the way that we remember information is spatially oriented.
Right. So we kind of touched on, she looked at a lot of these with patients who had amnesia. So they had damage to both of their hippocampus,
That's right.
So how can we tie in this information or these results of the study to older adults who also tend to show deficits in imagining the future? Because also like they show degeneration a lot of times in these temporal areas with the hippocampus. So has there been work on looking at older adults with this? And
yeah, so there is some suggestion that older people, when they're imagining, this is called episodic future thought, where you're asked to imagine a future scenario. There's a very large body of scientific literature on this topic. But there is some evidence that's come from Dan Schachter working at Harvard that older people do show a shift away from detail towards more generic descriptions when they're envisaging the future. Whether that's specifically because of age-related changes in the hippocampus rather than other regions of the brain is unknown.
Interesting. Yeah, because I mean, we've talked about it on this podcast before, but older adults show episodic memory deficit. So when we ask them to retrieve memory from what for example, what did they have for breakfast, they might not retrieve as much detailed information as a younger adult.
Absolutely.
So it's very interesting to see that translate to also future envisioning and thinking.
Yeah.
And also, I guess, navigation as well.
Navigation as well.
Navigation.
Absolutely. Yes.
So clearly Eleanor's work changed the field, but she also inspired a lot of people. How did she influence the current and next generation of researchers?
So I think people who went through her lab unquestionably got an incredibly rich scientific experience. I think there's a quote she was fond of saying, "We're here to plant seeds, not to trim hedges." So she was very focused on always thinking about what are the big important questions rather than kind of incremental things. And I think that had an influence on people who worked with her. And more generally, I think she was a fantastic role model for beginning cognitive neuroscientists, and of course a fantastic role model for female scientists.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that she did a lot of work with like school children in the London area, like having them write essays about
She did.
science
She established an essay competition for school kids.
To help kind of increase interest in science. And she also obviously inspired the further research into the relationship between structure and function, which we kind of take for granted now, but that's a pretty big leap.
That was another thing. I mean, she was doing that. There were a bunch of folks at the same time in Queen Square focused on those sorts of questions, but she was undoubtedly one of the leading lights in that area.
And also kind of making us realize that the hippocampus isn't just for memory.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of overlap in other aspects of cognition, which I think was very important. So are there any younger scientists in particular that you think she inspired or helped to shape?
Gosh, I wouldn't want to single anyone out, but I can't resist mentioning someone who was, I think, a postdoctoral fellow with her, Demi Hassabis, who went on to found what became Google Mind, and who won
Google DeepMind.
DeepMind, and then it became Google Mind.
Oh, did it?
Yes, it did.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God, I didn't know that.
Yes.
That's still at Google DeepMind.
Yes. Anyway,
I like the DeepMind part.
So he won the Nobel Prize just a couple of years ago for the development of an AI system that could predict protein structure from the constituent amino acids. Somewhat removed from the work he was doing with Eleanor, but I've no doubt that she had a huge influence on him.
Yeah, I don't know if people realize that a lot of the type of work that places like Google Mind and these AI companies do is predicated on a lot of neuroscience.
Yes,
it is. Neuroscience, understanding the brain and using that to, I guess, model what they think
That's exactly right.
be doing, and that maybe was what led him.
Yeah, like neural networks. Is a lot of
to connect those two
That's
things.
exactly right. Yep.
So we touched on individuals with amnesia who have damage to their hippocampus, but there's another group that Eleanor worked with, individuals who were kind of born already with some damage to their hippocampus, which is called developmental amnesia. So can you explain what that is and then what kind of work she did with these patients?
So developmental amnesia, as the name suggests, comes about because of damage to the hippocampus that people acquire at or very shortly after birth. So usually through oxygen deprivation. And these children grow up pretty normally, many of them. And it's not until they reach the age of about 5 or 6 that it's noticed that they have a memory impairment. The remarkable thing about these children is that they can do quite well at school, and they can learn quite well at school. They can learn so-called semantic or factual information. But they have very poor so-called episodic memory. They can't remember, for example, what they did the day before. They have trouble navigating around the world. And they grow up like this. So Eleanor did some work on one developmental amnesia participant in particular, very famous patient, and actually did some imaging studies with this individual, looking to see what was going on in what was the remnant of his hippocampus when he was engaged in different kinds of memory tasks. And so that was very interesting. And in one of the studies, one that I like particularly, they demonstrated that although there wasn't his hippocampus was very shrunken compared to a healthy individual, a healthy hippocampus, when he was engaged in demanding memory tasks, there was a small part of the hippocampus that did activate, that showed enhanced neural activity. And that suggested that some of the residual abilities that this participant had may be due to the fact that the hippocampus wasn't completely dysfunctional. And that was a very, very interesting study.
So when you say enhanced, do you mean more than normal in a hippocampus?
No,
I
didn't make myself clear. If you compare a non-memory condition to a memory condition, you can ask, do you see increased neural activity, or at least the fMRI version of neural activity, when you're actually engaged in the memory task, compared to a control condition? And he showed that, just like
so they were using the hippocampus for that memory task.
Yeah. Okay. So the inference is that his hippocampus was contributing. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. I wonder if, I guess it shows that there is no compensation then for damaged hippocampus, because there was the deficit in episodic memory would suggest that there wasn't. So it's like when other parts of the brain get damaged, sometimes in developmental cases, you get other parts of the brain that take over, but with the hippocampus, that doesn't seem to be so.
So one of the controversies in developmental amnesia is, why are these children so good at school?
Yeah.
Why can they acquire their times tables and learn the countries of the world? And there are two extreme positions on this. One of these is compensation. Because these kids have had a dysfunctional hippocampus from the get-go, there has been some compensation within the brain that means that other regions can support factual knowledge without the need for the hippocampus to kick in. And the alternative explanation is that there's just enough function left so that if you're exposed to the times table every day for most of your life as a kindergartner, which we all were, basically there's enough hippocampus there to take that information in and to store it in the rest of the brain. That's an unsettled debate. But when it comes to episodic memory, it looks like it's very difficult to compensate. if you're even as a child, if you grow up with a dysfunctional hippocampus, you always have a very poor episodic memory. And as I was saying, what Eleanor's work suggested was that the little bit of episodic memory perhaps that you can do seems to be relying on remnant contribution of the hippocampus.
So what would you say is Eleanor's major legacy as far as her research is concerned?
I would say two things. The first is a specific kind of theory about memory and the hippocampus, which was the scene construction theory. The idea that the hippocampus functions to take information from the rest of the brain and literally construct a vivid, spatially orientated image based on that information. And according to her theory, the hippocampus, when you are remembering remote information, for example, information from your childhood, that information isn't stored in the hippocampus anymore. The reason that you can generate a vivid memory of a childhood event isn't because the hippocampus is storing that memory. It's taking information from elsewhere in the brain and constructing almost like an imagination. It's like guided imagination. And the imagination refers back to these past events. And so the contribution of the hippocampus to very remote memories is basically, you can think of it as past guided imagination. The hippocampus does just the same thing as we were saying before when it comes to imagining future events or imagining something like what would it be like to walk on the moon. Tell me how you feel and what you see as you imagine walking on the moon. The ability to do that requires the hippocampus. So for Eleanor, the scene construction theory tries to unify cognition and imagination with memory by making the hippocampus the kind of focus or the locus of the ability to construct any kind of vivid, visually based scene. The second legacy is a more general one, which is this notion of trying to ask what is it that brains are doing when people are actually doing real life, real world activities. So towards the end of her career, she got very interested in a very new technology called optically pumped magnetometers. So these are little devices that sit on the scalp and they allow you to record magnetic waves from the brain. So this is a development of what's called magnetoencephalography. Traditionally, you had to sit inside a magnetically shielded chamber with your head fixed and with a device called an MEG system that was supercooled with liquid helium to be able to detect these signals. With this new technology, you could do this at room temperature and people could move around and move their heads around. And her goal was to use this technology to look at what the brain was doing, including the hippocampus, while people were actually solving real-time, real-world navigation tasks, walking around, literally, solving a task. And her main focus was, if we really want to know how the brain works, we need to look at how the brain is working while people are doing what the brain actually evolved to allow them to do.
Yeah, in a realistic
So
kind
this
of
is
manner.
what I was describing as the ecological approach.
Yeah, that's like super revolutionary because, I mean, the way we do it most of the times in the lab is we put people in these MRI machines and basically give them a task to do, but we're not seeing how that would apply to real world kind of instances.
Only indirectly, that is correct. So it's not that one of these approaches is right and one is wrong. And in fact, Eleanor absolutely was not dismissive of this kind of more controlled approach. She knew very well that a lot of the kind of questions that we want to address require a level of experimental control that is difficult to get in these ecologically more valid situations. There's a trade-off between control and ecological validity.
Yeah.
And she preferred one approach, but she was very respectful and very aware of the need for the other approach.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you definitely need both because they
Yeah,
complement each
absolutely.
other. Right?
And so it was very easy to
Yeah.
have scientific discussions with her
Yeah.
without feeling like you were having to defend a particular position at all.
Yeah.
The discussions were much more substantive
Yeah.
than that.
Because to find something in one of those environments, like a very realistic VR environment, and then to replicate that when you've controlled for every other variable in
exactly
the lab, is
Yeah.
the perfect
So
kind
it's
of confirmation.
it's a two-way
Yeah.
street.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
What do you think we can all learn from the way Eleanor approached science?
I think we can learn that there's more than one way to ask questions. There's not necessarily one right way to do it. Eleanor chose a particular perspective and stuck with it. I think we can also learn about the importance of commitment and really following a question and looking for the big questions. She was very focused on this idea of not being a stamp collector, so to speak. Let other people do that.
Yeah.
She was asked after the big questions.
Yeah.
But I think her focus and combining that with humility and with being a fun person.
So Dr. Eleanor Maguire helped us better understand memory in a completely new way, not just as a way to remember, but as a system for building who we are and how we see the world. She was a scientist, a mentor, a trailblazer, and clearly a deeply beloved person. Mick, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your insights into the work of Dr. Eleanor Maguire.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Neurologic, a CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran for editing this episode. To learn more about the Centre for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.